Welcome back. In our previous sessions, we've been talking about the written Constitution. We're taking a kind of a leisurely stroll, a guided tour, if you will, through the written Constitution from start to finish. We started with the preamble. We're now in the middle of our discussion of Article 1, and in later lectures we'll talk about Articles 2, 3, 4, etc. in textual order. We'll work our way through to the end of the written Constitution, and then we'll start strolling through the amendments in textual order, which is also chronological order, since the amendments have been added in chronological sequence. The guidebook for this leisurely tour is a textbook that I wrote in 2005. It's called America's Constitution, a Biography. It's not required reading for the course, but it is available to you, and if you want more details about the things that we're talking about in these lectures, more documentation and elaboration and qualification, citation, all of that, then do feel free to pick up a copy of America's Constitution, a Biography. You can get it at most public libraries. It's also available at many bookstores online. I think a paperback copy will run you about $15 or so. And that book, written for you all, for a general audience, tries to, as we've been doing in these lectures, walk you through the written Constitution in textual order. There are 12 chapters of that book, and we've been going through the book, in effect, chapter by chapter. Each chapter has a picture, and I think that picture is worth 1,000 words. It tells a story. Chapter 1 opened with a picture of the first newspaper printing of the proposed Constitution in September 1787. And I think that picture captures some big themes, that people were paying attention to the proposed Constitution. The newspaper published that immediately after the Philadelphia Convention went public with its proposal, that newspaper editors understood the significance of the preamble in particular, which appeared in bigger type. And you see the great themes of the Constitution in the preamble, it seems to me. That's why we spent a whole chapter, really, on a single sentence. What are those themes? Democracy, we, the people of the United States. Geography, it's the people of the United States, of a continent, but of a particular place. It's not we, the people of the world. And indeed, national security is a third and related idea. It's us, it's we, and it's us to some extent against them, against the British or the Spanish, the French, the Native Americans. This is about the people of the United States creating a project, ordaining and establishing a constitution in a very democratic way. Again, that democratic idea, in order, among other things, to promote a common defense. So again, you see this national security idea, and you see it all in this opening sentence. National security, common defense will help us secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. By keeping the old powers of Europe at bay, we and our descendants will be free. We and our posterity will enjoy the blessings of liberty. And that was the preamble. That was chapter 1, and I think you see those themes in that opening picture. Chapter 2 was about the structure of Congress. It was about the opening sections of Article 1 of the Constitution, the article about the legislature, and it was about the structure of the Congress, of the legislature, its basic size, its shape. For example, it has 2 houses. It's got a bicameral, symmetric shape. We talked about the apportionment rules in the House and the way in which the Senate was apportioned. The House is based on population. The Senate, each state, regardless of population, gets an equal say. We talked about eligibility rules for members of the House and Senate, who gets to pick members of the House and the Senate, the terms for which, the terms of office that these lawmakers serve. So we talked about the basic structure of Congress, and we began that chapter with a picture that, again, I think is worth 1,000 words, a picture that shows you a big building. It's a big building because it's designed to be the people's branch of government very distinctively, and indeed Article 1 very early on echoes the preamble in talking about a House of Representatives from the people. When you look at that big building, which is to make sure that the legislature is going to be of a sufficient size to be truly representative and democratic of the citizenry, it's a building also needs to be big enough to house public galleries of the people who can watch the people's business being attended to. So it has to be big enough for that. You see in the building itself the bicameralism. It's kind of a symmetric building with the House on one side and the Senate on the other. I think in our conversation about Article 1, you saw also some of the themes of national security, the debate about the size of Congress, for example. It needs to be democratic, but you also want to make sure that the people there actually have some sense of the world. They have to be a select group, an elite group of some sort, in order to sensibly fashion American foreign policy, defense policy, and the like. So you don't want the Senate too big because it's going to need to be composed of people who really do have a special understanding about the world. We talked about how, for example, you want longer terms of office for senators than in states because, again, of the need to develop some expertise. Geography fits into that story, too. Just looking at Article 1, you see, for example, that there are not annual elections for Congress every 2 years for the House, and that's partly because it takes a while to get from the edges of the continent to the center. The Union is much bigger, of course, than an individual state. There's more travel time that will be required. That was the basic size and structure of Congress of Article 1. Now we're segueing into a new chapter talking about the basic powers of Congress. We begin with a picture, and we're moving from the outdoor indoors. And here you see Henry Clay. He's a senator. He's addressing the United States Senate in the antebellum period. And we see a couple of interesting things in this picture. We see that there's a public gallery up in the balcony, so the people are watching. The Senate didn't begin, actually, as an open body. The House was open to the public from day one. The Senate soon followed suit in the mid-1790s and never went back. So the people are watching the people's business being done. Uniquely, I think, among the three branches, that the Congress is an entity very much open to public inspection and deliberation. That's less true of the executive branch. A lot of things that executive officials do, they do in secret, espionage and negotiating treaties, all sorts of stuff that's not in the public eye. Planning defense tactics. Lots of stuff that happens in the executive branch, thinking about whom they're going to nominate before they name the person. A lot of things in the executive branch are more secret. The public isn't there watching the president at every moment in the Oval Office. But here, they're watching the senators. Now, the senators also sometimes will be meeting in private in cloakrooms and the like. But the people are watching when the Senate is engaged in debate, deliberation. This is the age, especially the antebellum era of America, of famous senatorial oratory, of the great speeches that are being offered and listened to. So Henry Clay is a great orator. In this chamber, actually, we see Daniel Webster is there, John C. Calhoun is there. This is a reminder that Congress is a speech spot. It's a parley place, a place for political discourse. In England, they call the legislature the Parliament, from the French parler, to speak. So this is a place where not only people vote, they speak, and they are listened to by the public. And indeed, in Article 1, we can think of it as one of the great powers of Congress. It's not always conceptualized that way, but there is a clause in Article 1 that affirms the absolute, quote, freedom of speech and debate in the House and the Senate. And the idea here is that whatever Henry Clay or Daniel Webster or John C. Calhoun says then, or today Mitch McConnell or Harry Reid, whatever a senator says, whatever a representative says on the floor of the Senate, on the floor of the House, is absolutely sacred free speech. It cannot be punished outside that body. Now, if you misbehave and you say things that are inappropriate, the chamber itself might hold you in contempt or might discipline you, but you can't be sued in a court for libel by a private person who doesn't like what you said about him or his industry on the floor of the House or the Senate. You can't be put in prison by judges or the executive branch. Absolute free speech and debate in the House and the Senate, as there was absolute free speech and debate in Parliament in England. Now, in America, as we're going to see in later lectures, not just our representatives, but the citizens themselves have speech and debate, freedom. The First Amendment is the next free speech clause that gets going to be added to the Constitution, and this is going to talk about, again, this idea of freedom of speech, just like freedom of speech and debate. But the rights of the citizenry are a little different than the rights of lawmakers. There is an even more absolute freedom of speech and debate in the House and Senate. No libel law at all. If in the real world a citizen gets up and says something that's intentionally and maliciously false, gets up and just lies to someone's detriment, there are libel suits that can be brought, civil lawsuits for damages that can be brought. But there's a more absolute freedom of speech and debate in Congress under the Constitution. So this is a very special speech spot, and we'll talk more about that freedom of speech idea in later lectures. Now, I want to move from Article 1, Sections 5 and 6 that talk about some of the special immunities and privileges of members of Congress to Article 1, Section 8, the powers of Congress. Article 1, the first article, is the longest article. Section 8 is within that the longest section. So now we're going to be talking about the longest section of the first and longest article of the Constitution. So something important here is going on. And the important thing is that the powers of Congress are very broad but still enumerated, finite. They are not infinite. Now, the question of how much power the central government should have, and within the central government, how much power the legislature should have, these were really important issues in the 1700s, and they remain so today. Let me just remind you that the British Empire basically breaks up, in a sense, over this question, a question that's called the question of federalism, in part. What should the central government do? What should be left to the individual component units? So in the 1760s and 1770s, the question was, what could Parliament do and what could Parliament not do? Before the 1760s, there had been a kind of a working understanding in America that Parliament could regulate imperial affairs, trade within the empire, foreign affairs between the empire and the other powers of the world, France and Spain and so on. So Parliament could regulate that, and local governments, the colonies, would basically deal with taxation and lots of internal matters. But then, beginning with the Stamp Act, or the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act and the Townshend Duties and the Coercive Acts in the 1760s and 1770s, Parliament begins to pass all sorts of laws that that are designed to raise revenue from the colonies, to regulate internal matters in the colonies, and the colonists push back. They say, wait a minute, you can't do that. And the British say, well, listen, if we can legislate for anything in the empire, like foreign affairs, like imperial trade, if we can regulate anything, we can regulate everything. You can't sort of draw lines and say, well, the central government can do only some things, and other things have to be reserved to the individual colonies. Well, the colonies thought somehow you could try to codify, constitutionalize, if you will, the working arrangement that had existed before the 1760s. The empire, the parliament, will deal with certain central matters, and other things should be reserved to the individual colonies. They tried to sort of propose that, a constitutionalization, a codification of that working understanding, and the Brits said no. Parliament must be supreme in all cases whatsoever, and take it or leave it. And the American revolutionaries said, well, in that case, we decide to leave it. Now, the Articles of Confederation soon emerged. How are these individual colonies going to arrange matters among themselves? Because you're going to need some central coordination for war and foreign affairs and all the rest. But on the other hand, the colonies individually want to retain certain powers. So how are you going to constitutionalize federalism after the independence? And what happens is an Articles of Confederation emerge, and the central government, Congress, are given certain powers, basically of treaty making and war and peace, directing common defense, and almost everything else is reserved to the states. And there's a clause that says everything that the federal government, that the central government does, has to be expressly enumerated, listed in the Articles of Confederation, and everything else is reserved to the states, each of which retains its freedom and sovereignty and independence, except for those few things that have been expressly delegated to the central government. And here's now the dilemma. The Parliament was too strong, and the colonies revolted. The Confederation Congress is too weak to do all the things that need to be done. So now the Constitution is going to come along and try to rebalance the thing, try to get it just right. And that rebalancing occurs most obviously in Article 1, Section 8, listing the powers that Congress has. Now, the word expressly isn't going to appear in Article 1, Section 8. So Congress is going to have not only the listed powers, but also certain implied powers that flow from a fair reading of the listed powers. So that word express isn't going to be there. It caused problems under the Articles of Confederation. So let's look at that list of express powers, Article 1, Section 8. And let's just kind of quickly start to work through it, and then in our next lecture we'll continue to work through Article 1, Section 8 and the rest of Article 1. Here's how it begins. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Okay, so right off the bat, Congress is going to be able to tax us up and down and sideways. Taxes, yes, but not just taxes, but duties and imposts and excises. We've just fought recently an anti-tax revolution, and now actually the Constitution is proposing a pro-tax regime. What's up with that? What's up with that is this new Congress is representative. Ordinary people are going to be able to vote for it. The American Revolution, the rallying cry wasn't no taxation, period, no taxation, exclamation point. It was no taxation without representation. Parliament didn't represent ordinary Americans. Colonists didn't get to vote for Parliament, so Parliament couldn't impose taxes on ordinary colonists, revenue measures. That was the idea of the American Revolution. Since Parliament doesn't represent us, Parliament shouldn't tax us. But now, this new Congress is going to represent us. So it does have legitimacy to impose taxes on us. Remember, in the Articles of Confederation, under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress didn't directly represent individuals. Only the states were represented, qua states, as states, so only the states could be taxed. And the problem is they didn't pay. When they were asked for money, they didn't pay up. Now individuals are going to be able to be taxed when they import goods through the customs house or in other ways. And if the individual doesn't pay, then the federal government will be able to make that individual pay. That's a fight that the federal government can win. It's legitimate because people are represented. So in some ways, not the absolutist power that Parliament had to impose taxation without representation, and not the inadequate power under the Articles of Confederation, really an absence of a power to tax, but actually now a power to tax individuals by a genuinely representative body. And why do we need that? The first sentence of the longest section of the longest article tells us why. Congress is going to need to have power to lay and collect taxes, imposts, duties, and excises. Why? To pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Note the echo of the preamble, common defense, general welfare. Here's why you have to pay, because we actually are going to need national security. That's going to require an army. Armies need to be paid. They need to have bullets and shoes and supplies. That's going to cost money. So, and you Americans need to support a Constitution, the Federalists argue. You're going to be taxed under this Constitution, but you're going to be taxed by a representative body for national security. So in that first sentence of Article 1, we see a continuation of some of the great themes of the preamble, of the Constitution as a whole, democracy and national security. In our next lecture, we'll work through the rest of Article 1, Section 8, and indeed the rest of Article 1, and see these great themes of national security and geography and democracy playing out. We'll also talk a little bit more about slavery in Article 1. See you then.